December 19th, 1944. That's the date when one man proved that impossible is just a word. They thought they had him. 21 German soldiers, rifles raised, surrounding one man in the middle of a frozen Belgian forest. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and completely out of options. But when they ordered him to surrender, he did something nobody expected. He smiled. Not a nervous smile. Not the smile of a man accepting his fate. No, this was the smile of someone who knew something they didn't. And in the next 45 seconds, that smile turned into the deadliest moment those German soldiers would ever witness. What happened next became one of the most insane true stories of World War II. A moment so unbelievable that even the soldiers who survived it couldn't fully explain how one man pulled it off. This is the story of a warrior who turned certain death into absolute chaos, and by the end of this video, you're going to understand why his name is still whispered with equal parts fear and respect. But before we dive into those 45 seconds that changed everything, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button right now. You're on the WWII channel, and if you love real stories about real warriors who did the impossible, you're in the right place. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. December 1944, the Ardennes Forest in Belgium. If you know anything about World War II, you know this place. The Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allied forces and turn the tide of the war. Over 200,000 German troops launched a surprise offensive through the densest, most difficult terrain in Western Europe. Thousands of American soldiers were dug in across frozen fields and dense woods, trying to hold the line against this massive wave of enemy forces. It was brutal. Temperatures were below zero, sometimes hitting -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Supply lines were cut off, and German forces were coming at them from every direction. The snow was knee-deep in some places, and the cold was so intense that soldiers were losing fingers and toes to frostbite within hours of exposure. Equipment was freezing solid. Weapons were jamming. Oil in the tanks was turning to sludge. Men were dying not just from bullets and shells, but from exposure to the elements. Medics couldn't keep up with the casualties. Food was running low. Ammunition was being rationed. It was hell on earth, and in the middle of all this chaos was a sergeant. Let's call him Jack, because his real identity was classified for decades after the war, and even today, some details remain locked in military archives. Jack wasn't your typical soldier. He'd grown up in the mountains of Montana, in a small town so remote that the nearest neighbor was 5 miles away. His father had been a hunter and trapper, and Jack had learned to track animals before he could read. By the time he was 12, he could follow a deer trail that was 3 days old. By 15, he was hunting alone in terrain that experienced outdoorsmen wouldn't dare enter. He could move through the woods like a ghost, making no sound, leaving no trace. He could read the land like a book, understanding weather patterns, animal behavior, the subtle signs that most people would never notice. He knew which way the wind was blowing just by watching the trees. He could tell if someone had passed through an area hours earlier by looking at broken twigs and disturbed leaves. Most importantly, he could stay calm when everything around him was falling apart. While other hunters would panic when a bear charged or when they got lost in a blizzard, Jack would just slow down his breathing, assess the situation, and figure out the solution. Those skills were about to be tested in ways he never imagined. Skills that would mean the difference between life and death, not just for him, but for countless Allied soldiers depending on what happened next. Jack's unit, a reinforced rifle squad of 12 men, had been tasked with holding a small ridge that overlooked a critical supply route. This wasn't just any position. This was a choke point. If the Germans took that ridge, they'd have a clear path to cut off thousands of Allied troops fighting further east. The entire defensive line could collapse, and the German advance would push deep into Allied territory, possibly reaching the Meuse River and splitting the Allied forces in two. So Jack and his squad dug in, set up defensive positions, and waited. They created foxholes in the frozen ground, which was like trying to dig through concrete. They set up fields of fire, placed their machine gun to cover the most likely approaches, and rationed their ammunition carefully. For 2 days, they held that position against wave after wave of German attacks. Artillery shells turned the forest into a hellscape of shattered trees and frozen mud. The constant bombardment was deafening, terrifying. Trees that had stood for 100 years were reduced to splinters in seconds. The ground shook so hard that men's teeth rattled. Shrapnel cut through the air like angry hornets, and the smell of explosives and burning wood filled their lungs. Machine gun fire never seemed to stop. The Germans would attack, get driven back, regroup, and attack again. They were relentless, determined to take this this position at any cost. Men were dying all around Jack, but he kept his squad together, kept them fighting, kept them alive. When Private Morrison froze up during an attack, too terrified to return fire, Jack crawled over to him under intense fire and talked him through it, got him back in the fight. When their machine gunner took shrapnel to the leg, Jack dragged him to cover, bandaged the wound himself, and took over the gun until someone else could man it. When they ran low on ammunition for their rifles, Jack organized a redistribution, making sure every man had enough rounds to keep fighting. He was everywhere at once, leading by example, showing his men that they could survive this if they just kept their heads and did their jobs. His calmness under fire became legendary in those 2 days. While other men were shaking with fear and exhaustion, Jack was steady as a rock. His men started to believe that if Jack said they could hold, then they could hold. And for 2 days, they did. They held that ridge against everything the Germans threw at them, and they didn't give an inch. But on the third day, December 19th, everything changed. A German patrol, larger and better equipped than anything they'd seen before, hit their position just before dawn. This wasn't a probing attack or a harassment operation. This was a full-scale assault by veteran troops who knew exactly what they were doing. The Germans had brought up reinforcements during the night, moving silently through the forest under cover of darkness. They'd positioned machine guns on the flanks, brought up a mortar team, and had at least 40 soldiers ready to overrun the American position. Jack's squad was down to 8 men by this point. 4 had been killed in the previous attacks, and 2 others had been evacuated with serious wounds. The survivors were exhausted, running on nothing but adrenaline, coffee, and willpower. They were low on ammunition. Each man had maybe 30 rounds left for his rifle. The machine gun was down to 1 belt. They had 2 grenades between them, and now they were facing an assault force 5 times their size, hitting them from 3 directions at once. The Germans came hard and fast, using the darkness and the forest to their advantage. Their machine guns opened up first, raking the American foxholes with devastating fire. Then came the mortars, dropping shells right into the defensive position with terrifying accuracy. Someone had given them the exact coordinates. Within minutes, Jack's position was being torn apart. Explosions ripped through their foxholes. Trees came crashing down. The air was thick with smoke and the screams of wounded men. Jack tried to coordinate a defense, shouting orders over the chaos, but it was impossible. The Germans were too close, too many, too well coordinated. He watched his men go down one by one. Corporal Davies took a bullet to the chest and died before he hit the ground. Private Chen was hit by shrapnel from a mortar and bled out in seconds. The machine gunner, who'd just returned to his position after getting his leg wound treated, was killed by a direct hit from a rifle grenade. One by one, Jack watched his men die or get captured. Some tried to fight back, firing until their ammunition ran out, then fighting with knives and rifle butts until they were overwhelmed. Others tried to surrender, raising their hands, shouting that they were giving up, but the Germans were in a killing frenzy and cut them down anyway. Jack tried to fall back, tried to regroup with whoever was left, but the Germans had them surrounded. They'd cut off every escape route. He could hear German voices all around him, shouting orders, coordinating their assault. He grabbed what ammunition he could from the bodies of his fallen men, knowing he'd need every round. He stuffed grenades into his pockets, took an extra rifle, and started moving through the trees. His only thought was survival. Get away from the position. Find a way through the German lines. Make it back to Allied territory, and warn them that this ridge was lost. And then, in the chaos, and the smoke, and the screaming, Jack found himself alone. His entire squad was gone, dead or captured. He was the last man standing from a unit that had held this position for 3 days against overwhelming odds. And now, he was running for his life through a forest crawling with German soldiers who wanted him dead. He moved through the trees, using every trick he'd learned as a kid in Montana. Stay low, move slow, don't break the pattern of the forest. When you move, move like water, flowing around obstacles, taking the path of least resistance. Don't skyline yourself on ridges. Stay in the shadows. Use the terrain to mask your movement. Watch for sentries. Listen for voices, for the sound of equipment, or anything that might give away enemy positions. For a while, it worked. Jack was a ghost in those woods. He slipped past German patrols that were so close he could hear them breathing. He avoided their search parties by reading the signs of their passage and going a different direction. He moved through terrain so dense that the Germans assumed no one would try to use it as an escape route. Thick brambles that tore at his uniform, fallen logs covered in ice that required careful climbing, steep ravines that had to be descended in near total darkness. Jack navigated all of it, driven by the single-minded determination mission to survive, to escape, to make it back to friendly lines and tell his commanders what had happened. He'd been moving for almost 2 hours, covering maybe 3 miles of incredibly difficult terrain, when he started to think he might actually make it. He could hear Allied artillery in the distance, which meant he was getting close to friendly positions. Maybe another mile, maybe 2. He just had to keep moving, keep his focus, stay smart. But the forest was crawling with enemy soldiers, and eventually his luck ran out. He rounded a thick stand of pines, moving carefully, checking his angles, and walked straight into a German squad. 21 men, all armed, all staring right at him. For a second, nobody moved. It was like time stopped. Jack's rifle was in his hands, 1 round in the chamber, maybe a dozen more in the magazine. The Germans had him dead to rights. Their weapons were up, fingers on triggers. Some had rifles, others had MP-40 submachine guns. A few had stick grenades hanging from their belts. They were spread out in a loose formation, but they'd been moving through the forest and had bunched up slightly when they spotted him. Their officer, a young lieutenant with cold blue eyes and a confident smirk, stepped forward from the group. He looked like he was maybe 25 years old, probably from a good family. The kind of guy who'd grown up expecting to lead men. He had that aristocratic bearing that German officers often had, the certainty that he was superior to everyone around him. The lieutenant said something in German. Jack didn't speak the language fluently, but he'd picked up enough words during his time in combat to understand the basics. The officer was telling him to drop his weapon, to surrender, to accept that he was beaten. The tone was condescending, almost amused, like the lieutenant couldn't believe this filthy American soldier had actually thought he could escape. Some of the other German soldiers were smiling too, relaxed now that they had their prey cornered. They'd been chasing survivors from the American position for hours, hunting them through the forest like animals. This was just one more to add to the count. One more prisoner to march back to their lines, or maybe just one more body to leave in the woods. They weren't particularly worried about which. The lieutenant spoke again, more forcefully this time, gesturing with his pistol for Jack to drop his rifle. One of the German soldiers, a big guy with a scar on his face, laughed and said something that made the others chuckle. Jack didn't need to understand German to know they were mocking him, enjoying his situation, savoring their victory. And that's when Jack did something that still doesn't make sense to anyone who hears this story. He laughed. Not a crazy laugh, not a panicked laugh, not the desperate laugh of a man who's lost his mind under the stress of combat. Just a low, quiet chuckle, like someone had just told him a joke. His shoulders shook slightly. His eyes crinkled at the corners. He looked at the German lieutenant, then at the circle of soldiers around him, and he smiled. A genuine smile. The German lieutenant looked confused. His smirk faded, replaced by uncertainty. His men glanced at each other, unsure what to make of this American soldier who was smiling in the face of certain death. Was he crazy? Was this some kind of trick? Had he lost his mind? One of the German soldiers shouted something, probably an order to drop his weapon. The lieutenant raised his pistol, pointing it directly at Jack's head. The message was clear. Drop the rifle now, or die. Jack looked around at the circle of rifles and submachine guns pointed at him, at the faces of men who thought they'd already won, at the tight formation they'd made around him. And then his mind started working, faster than it ever had before. He wasn't thinking about surrender. He wasn't thinking about death. He was thinking about angles and distances and timing. He was thinking about the terrain under their feet, the trees around them, the way the Germans had positioned themselves. He was thinking about Montana, about hunting, about how predators always assume they have the advantage right up until the moment the tables turn. See, Jack had noticed something the Germans hadn't. They were standing in a natural depression in the forest floor, a slight dip maybe 2 feet lower than the surrounding terrain. It was subtle, barely noticeable, unless you were looking for it, but it was there. The Germans had unconsciously moved into this low spot because it offered slight cover from potential fire from the American lines. But what they hadn't realized was that they'd formed themselves into a killing box. They were standing close together, almost shoulder to shoulder in some places, forming a tight circle around Jack. It was a textbook mistake, the kind of thing that gets taught in basic training. Never bunch up, maintain spacing, create fields of fire that don't cross. But these soldiers were tired, cold, hungry. They'd been fighting for days. They'd grown overconfident. They thought the fight was over, and that moment of relaxation, that slight lowering of their guard, was about to cost them everything. Jack had also noticed the trees. place. Old growth forest, thick trunks, heavy branches, good cover if you could reach it. And he'd noticed the German soldier closest to him on the right side. Young kid, maybe 19, holding his rifle a little too casually, finger outside the trigger guard. That was going to be his first target. Jack had maybe 3 seconds before the Germans lost patience and shot him. 3 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether he lived or died. 3 seconds to calculate odds, plan moves, and commit to a course of action that was absolutely insane. Any rational person would have surrendered. The math was simple. 21 armed soldiers against one exhausted man who was almost out of ammunition. It was suicide to fight. But Jack had never been very good at accepting what other people said was impossible. And besides, surrender wasn't a guarantee of survival anyway. He'd heard stories about what happened to American prisoners. Some were treated according to the Geneva Convention. Others weren't so lucky. Some were shot. Some disappeared. And even if these Germans did take him prisoner, he'd spend the rest of the war in a POW camp, assuming he survived the march back to German lines. No, surrender wasn't acceptable. If he was going to die, it would be fighting. And maybe, just maybe, if he was smart and fast and lucky, he wouldn't die at all. The German lieutenant shouted something, his patience finally exhausted. He started to squeeze the trigger on his pistol, and Jack moved. What happened in the next 45 seconds is almost impossible to describe, but I'm going to try. Jack didn't charge forward like some Hollywood action hero. He didn't dive for cover or try to run. Instead, he did something that turned his biggest disadvantage into his greatest weapon. He used their confidence against them, used their formation against them, used the terrain against them. He became the chaos that wins fights. Jack spun to his right in one smooth, explosive motion, bringing his rifle up as he turned. His first shot hit the young German soldier who'd been holding his rifle casually, the one Jack had identified as the weak point. The round caught him in the chest and dropped him instantly. Before the body even started to fall, Jack was already firing his second and third shots. The second round hit the German soldier standing next to the first, taking him in the shoulder and spinning him around. The third shot hit another soldier who was starting to react, starting to bring his weapon up. That shot hit him in the neck, and he went down hard, blood spraying. 3 shots, maybe 2 seconds. 3 Germans down. And suddenly, the tight circle had a gap.